This installment of the Anguilla Financial Services Commission's FinTech and Compliance webinar series was recorded on location at Tranquility Beach in Anguilla, British West Indies.
We're here on Tranquility Beach, Meads Bay, Anguilla, and today for this installment, I'm joined by Dr. Michael Willis. Dr. Willis is a director of the Global Leadership Management for Accounting program at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School, as well as senior faculty in the management practice. Prior to joining Cambridge, he taught courses in financial accounting, managerial accounting, data analytics, corporate finance, accounting ethics to undergraduates, postgraduate, and executive audiences. Dr. Willis earned a PhD in accounting from the Wharton School of Business. Thank you, Dr. Willis, for joining us today.
Thank you, Simone. It's great to be here.
All right, so today we are talking about data analytics in financial services, in particular focus on regulators. And I'm interested in your views on the potential evolution of data analytics in financial services regulation.
Great. So let me just start by defining some terms here before we jump in, because data analytics is one of those terms that doesn't necessarily have an agreed upon definition, and it kind of means whatever we want it to mean. So what I want it to mean is the use of computational techniques and data to generate and answer relevant questions in support of relevant decisions, and or to automate or improve tasks and decisions. That's how I see analytics. And so when we think about the world of analytics techniques, one way to think about that is in three areas: descriptive techniques, predictive, and prescriptive. So descriptive analytics techniques would be seeking to describe how the world works, what's going on or what's been going on. And if you took statistics at university, you learned how to calculate means and medians and modes, right, and quartiles and histograms and scatter plots, and this is descriptive analytics. Okay, it's commonly done with visualization techniques, and we do this all the time. This doesn't take a PhD in statistics. It doesn't take a software engineer. We do this in Excel. We do this in PowerPoint. And it's done sometimes, many times, just to understand and explore a data set. So you may get this new data set and you don't know what the variables look like, what potential relationships could be. So even before we start to generate questions, we may do some exploration of the data set. And this shouldn't be overlooked, because when we start talking about more sophisticated and exciting sounding names of algorithms, we should remember that in any statistical analysis, no matter how sophisticated the end model will be, the researcher is going to start by looking at scatter plots and looking at histograms and simple pairwise correlations between the variables in the data set, just to understand what it looks like. Visualization is also really important in the communication of insight. Okay, so not only for exploring data sets, but also for making an argument or trying to make a persuasive case for something. And this is one of those areas where the human element touches the technical element in a really important way, because now you're thinking about what's my purpose in communicating, and who is the audience, and how do I leverage our knowledge of how our brains and our eyes process information to encode particular things in color and in size and shape, etc. So building a good visualization is a bit of art and a bit of science. And I encourage people who are maybe just getting started in learning about data analytics to enter into this path through data visualization. There's a lot of really sort of non-technical ways to get to make your visualizations better. And so that's an analytics technique that doesn't take a PhD or serious coding skills to implement. And in the descriptive world, still, there are some really sophisticated techniques that are much more complex. Okay, so you can think about machine learning in this setting of descriptive analytics. So machine learning is an algorithm where its performance on some task improves with experience. So as the algorithm runs and runs and runs, it gets better at some task, however we choose to define better and measure the performance on that task. That's what machine learning is. It's really just maths. Computers are good at maths and doing what we tell them to do. But in the world of machine learning, there are what we call supervised algorithms and unsupervised algorithms. So an unsupervised algorithm would be one that's really looking for patterns and associations and clusters. Okay, so our brains are really good at that for small pieces of data. So we can pick out, the picture frame on the wall that's crooked a little bit. But what about 1 billion data points with 100 variables? Our brains are not good at picking out that information, but computers are really good at spotting patterns in big data sets like that. So the strength of these unsupervised descriptive algorithms is that they can alert humans to areas that warrant future investigation. And this is where, sort of in a regulatory environment, audiences start to lean forward a bit, right? Because this is where technologies can be leveraged in forensic contexts and investigative contexts for things like anomaly detection, for analysis of social and financial networks, for clustering, if we're looking for certain groupings, right? So, high income and high frequency customers, for example, in a business setting, right? And also text analysis. The world of text mining and natural language processing, which we can talk about a little bit later, falls under this area. So this is an area I want to just make sure that we work in here, because I think that as we talk further about the paths of evolution in the regulatory space, I think this is a key. I think this is really a key important space where I think it might be most straightforward to make a business case for further investment. Okay, so that's the first sort of bucket in the analytics world, is the descriptive analytics. The next piece, or the other piece, is called predictive analytics, and that's where we're using large data sets to develop some model to make a prediction. Right. So, for example, a bank might be trying to predict whether a loan will be repaid, or a hospital might be trying to predict how long a patient will require a bed, or Netflix is trying to predict what show I'm going to want to binge watch next. So the difference between unsupervised learning and supervised learning is where the unsupervised techniques are sort of mining and looking for patterns. Supervised techniques take what we call a training data set, where we have data on the outcome variable. So for loans, for example, I would need a training data set, a historical data set with characteristics of loans. So I might have data on borrower characteristics and loan terms, and then I know for each of those historical loans whether it was repaid or not. Okay. So I use that data set to train my model. For the hospital context, we have data on patient attributes and diagnosis, and we know how many days or nights they required a bed in the hospital. So we use that training data to tune the model, and then we apply that model to new loans or new patients or new customers. So those are predictive analytics techniques. Okay. Then prescriptive analytics techniques would be where we're relying on the data and the algorithm to actually make a decision or to recommend a course of action. So this goes far beyond description and prediction into what should actually happen. What should we actually do? And this is where we start to get into AI spaces, right? So you can think of a self-driving car as falling in this prescriptive space, where the car is doing some prediction, absolutely, right? When it sees an object, it's going to make some prediction about what that object is likely to do. Is it likely to cross the path of the car? Is there likely to be a collision? Is it likely to go somewhere else, given everything else it observes? And it's not just going to make that prediction, but it's going to do something to my car. It's going to stop it or accelerate, or it's going to turn or change lanes or whatever. Pricing algorithms could be another example, right? So if I have some sort of dynamic pricing algorithm that's looking at market attributes and customer attributes to set a price, that would be an example of a prescriptive setting. So some observations, okay? Some observations about just the state of adoption and the state of investment right now, so that we could talk about what might happen in the future. First of all, in a business setting, investment in analytics on the revenue side of the business tends to outpace investment on the cost side. And that makes sense because the upside for acquiring new customers and selling to repeat customers and increasing market share is there, okay? So larger ROI for these customer facing and revenue center analytics. So they are sort of leading the way.
Right.
On the cost side, in more accounting and auditing and regulatory spaces, what we're seeing most often is ROI in frequent repetitive tasks that are in a narrow domain in a price competitive environment. Okay, so for example, you can think of a space like retail banks.
Okay.
Where they have a narrow space of transactions, withdrawals and deposits. They have a lot of data on these transactions. And they also have a narrow profit margin where there is ROI on the cost side, okay, that can be spread out over many millions of transactions across the world, let's say in a large bank. Okay, now there's a business case for investing in, let's say, anomaly detection or fraud detection analytics in that narrow space. In the audit space, for example, the auditing of contracts. And you might have an 800-page contract, and all these contracts need to be audited for these engagements. Firms have invested in machine learning algorithms, okay, that can look for patterns in the contract and pick out key terms for the contract. And then the auditor can just check those key findings from the algorithm. And by the way, the algorithm gets better over time because the auditor is sitting there giving it new training data, right? Because it clicks through and confirms these findings. So it's saving time and it's being trained at the same time. Now, this brings in a whole other host of issues of the use of analytics technologies in a regulated space. But the key there is it's a frequently done repetitive task that's time consuming that can be leveraged throughout a global network. Okay, so this is key because larger accounting firms can leverage this savings across the world, right, because of the standardization of the audit product. Okay, so on these sort of non-revenue analytics, that's where we're seeing the biggest ROI. Now, what's going on in the regulatory space? In the regulatory space, we have less data to work with as researchers. We just have less observations about what exactly is going on in the space. My sense is that it's possibly lagging further still behind cost center analytics in companies, with the exception, I think that the most advanced area would probably be in regulatory areas of financial markets where there's a large amount of transactional data. foreign exchange data and other market-based data, right? And there we can apply some unsupervised learning techniques and even some supervised learning techniques to get some insight, okay, to identify areas that warrant further human investigation. So I think that as we go on, I think the path for the regulatory side, because of the funding model, is to be really clear about the business case for investing in analytics technologies, being very clear about the value add of the technology and the value add of the human. And I think that that it's quite important not to undersell the role of the human. Okay, so audit firm, for example, might have a very sophisticated model, a risk prediction model, but there's really no substitute for walking out of a meeting with an engagement team and an executive team and having that conversation about, do we really trust these people?
That is true. That is true. And thank you for that. I think that definitely adds a lot of context to where we see data analytics coming into play in financial services. And I'm happy that you stress the importance of the human element, because there's always that factor of the feel, the intuitive engagement as well, in terms of having the face-to-face discussion. But another point that I've noticed is that from my perspective, academia has increased their engagement with regulators in recent years, and you've outlined the increasing importance of data analytics and to make that business case for it, particularly in regulatory engagements. And from our perspective, I think that it is fair to say that data analytics has been increasingly helpful in identifying emerging and continuing trends, as well as refining risk assessments. How do you envisage regulators benefiting from an increased knowledge and actual applied skills in data analytics, as opposed to outsourcing it, say, to an external third party, or to have dedicated persons within a regulatory authority that are placed in a division or unit?
Okay. So that's a great question, because it brings up a related question that I get asked all the time by students and by colleagues and practitioners is, what's going to happen to my job? How is AI, how is automation, how is robotics is it going to replace me? Is my accounting degree going to be obsolete in 10 years? And I think the answer is absolutely not, but it will change your job in the next 5, 10, 20 years, and it already has changed people's jobs. So there's some interesting data available to us, some survey data. Okay, so this was a company called Kaggle.com, which is a subsidiary of Google, which is their data science company and data science community. They host a lot of data sets and data science challenges, and it's kind of one of the hubs of the data analytics world. They did a really interesting survey of data science teams in different types of organizations around the world. And they asked the question, what are your problems? What are the problems with data analytics? And when they ranked those answers, the number one answer was dirty data. We can talk about that later, but that's a really important issue that's in the way. But then the next most significant challenges get into things like lack of data science talent, lack of management financial support, lack of a clear question to answer, results aren't used by decision makers, explaining data science to others, lack of domain expert input. So when you start to listen to these, and again, these are the data science teams that are responding to this, what I'm hearing is leadership doesn't really understand what we're doing. Maybe there's a disconnect between what they think analytics can do and what it actually can do. Maybe the questions aren't framed in the right way. Maybe the results aren't used for the decisions for whatever reason, but it's clear to me that there's a gap. Okay, so when you talk about outsourcing data science or putting analysts in a separate unit, that still may be the optimal arrangement for an organization, but we have to do something to try to connect leadership with data science teams in a more meaningful way. I have a quote here from an author, Scott Baronato, who's published on data analytics. This is from the Harvard Business Review, but he says, data teams know they're sitting on valuable insights but can't sell them. They say decision makers misunderstand or oversimplify their analysis and expect them to do magic to provide the right answers to all their questions. Executives, meanwhile, complain about how much money they invest in data science operations that don't provide the guidance they hoped for. They don't see tangible results because the results aren't communicated in their language. So that's the end of that quote. But the degree to which leaders and domain experts understand the strengths and the limitations of analytics technologies, the assumptions behind them will drive the effectiveness of the leader of analytics processes and the effectiveness of data processes in your organization. So I'm glad you phrased that in the context of academia and touch points with regulators, because there's a lot of opportunity out there to upskill around data science and data analytics, right? There's plenty of coursework. There's free. You can acquire technical skills today for free, right? Or very cheaply. There are lots of university level non-degree programs and degree programs that offer a lot of training in data analytics and data science. But one thing that I'm concerned about and particularly interested in is, if you think about if you've had training as an accountant at the university level, how were you trained? And I've trained many undergraduates, hundreds of undergraduate students in the US in accounting. And what's happened is undergraduate students are trained to pass exams. And the certification exams, the CPA, chartered accountant, whatever, has in a sense captured undergraduate accounting training. These qualifications are good things, right? When we hire an accountant, we need to know they're not going to land us in jail or turn us broke because they don't have technical competence in their field. But there's a limit to what additional material undergraduate and master's courses can fit in to a training program that's designed to turn out someone who's ready to take the CPA exam or chartered accountant's exam. So undergraduate programs are trying to incorporate data analytics training into their curriculum, but there's a limit to what they can do. So I guess my question is, who are the people that are going to lead this change, that are going to be able to connect leadership with analytics programs so that they can generate ROI on these technologies? I've known some young students, undergraduate students who spot this and they see, oh, I'm going to double major in computer science and accounting. And they are in really, really, really high demand from analytics firms, from software firms, from regulators, from accounting firms, because they can operate in both fields. They have the domain knowledge and they have the analytics technology knowledge. So maybe they focus on writing code, maybe they focus on management, maybe they move back and forth. But these are the kind of people that I think 5 to 10 years are going to be leading this change. I think that I'm going to be critical of academia here now for a bit. I think we're quite guilty of not connecting and inspiring people, our young students, to seek fields like regulation. Because I know that there are bright, motivated students who would make fantastic regulators, but they just aren't aware of the opportunities, or they think I must go to big company X because they hire the most students from my university and that will give me lots of options. And my parents want me to go to this firm, and everyone's heard of this firm. So I think we do a real disservice to our students that we're training when we don't expose them to these options like careers in regulation, And also because in working with students, undergraduate students and younger students, I'm finding that they have to have an emotional connection to their work or they're gone. And the societal role of the regulatory apparatus, I think, is something that they can potentially really connect to if they understand its importance. So what I'm saying is that I'm thinking about the long term here, the 5-year, 10-year, 20-year adoption path for analytics technologies in the regulatory environment. And I think, and I hope it starts with these undergraduates, okay? So we're talking right now in 2020, and if you're thinking about what do you do as a regulator right now or a financial services professional right now to become acquainted with analytics and be more effective leader of analytics processes, I think it's more detailed knowledge of the technologies themselves. In 5 to 10 years, I think we'll start to see people coming up with those technologies as part of their undergraduate training. And so I think that over time, that is the adoption path that we'll see. And I think it's incumbent on academia to, again, to inspire that in those students and prepare them to be leaders of innovation in the regulatory space. I think that other touch points related to data between academia and regulation could connect to research, right? So there are always interesting research questions and interesting data sets to be found in regulatory data, and academics with the skills to weigh in on those, to try to use that data to draw insights that are relevant internally to the regulator and externally as well. So I think there's quite a lot of potential areas of collaboration and touch points between the two spaces.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Willis. I have to definitely agree with you that there's more that could be done in relation to inspiring young persons to take up a job in regulation. It's not always seen as the first point of employment for many persons, but I do believe that you're right, that the students who are now in the undergraduate program and through initiatives like this one will bring a greater awareness of the collaboration and the benefits that could be had by both academia and by regulators. But going back to the data analytics point and some of the challenges that continue to exist, regulators tend to receive a lot of unstructured data, which is likely to leave regulators in a state of being data dark, where information is received but not subject to any structuring or any analysis. How could regulators look to reduce the risk of sitting on data that is not being used or assessed to greater effect?
That's a good question. So this is a space that's really ripe for innovation because much of our analytics techniques, particularly predictive analytics techniques, rely on structured data. That's in a nice tabular format, and we have Excel type data, and we can load that into our statistics programs, and we can feed it into the data science. And by the way, at a very low cost, people with very little expertise have access to world-class data science algorithms without even really knowing what's going on under the hood. That's really dangerous. You shouldn't do that. You should always know what's going on under the hood. But what do we do with all the other data? The text-based data and call transcripts and even video and audio and images. And so some of this falls under, at least the text bit falls under natural language processing and text mining algorithms, okay? So these are techniques that are intended to find some meaning in a text. And this can be something as simple as counting the frequency of words in a document. You could also count the frequency of words in a document that are contained in another set of words called a dictionary that measures a particular tone. So you could score a document for its optimism or its pessimism or it's risk aversion. So the success of these types of algorithms, again, tends to come in this narrow domain in repeated applications with lots of data. So for example, you could think of like a customer call center where people are always taking calls and they're always being recorded, right? So you have the transcript of the customer service rep, you have the transcript of the customer, and these are being logged continuously. Maybe it's a retail bank, right? So we can look for cues about tone based on the words, for example. We could look for indications that the customer is particularly upset, is angry, is displeased for whatever reason. We could go to auditory voice cues, to inflection, to volume, and in that way, try to identify particular conversations that need to be managed, that will give us more insight and will give us more data. And some big banks have had a lot of success with this, actually implementing analytics around their customer calls. On the academic side, there's been research looking at tone and other attributes of financial statement disclosures, MD&As, conference call transcripts, and vocal cues, again, in conference calls with executives. And academic research has associated some of these cues and some of these tonal measures with risk-taking behavior, other disclosure patterns, real activities in the business, the degree to which companies use particular types of accruals. But again, these are really limited settings. So I think that the value here is going to come from, rather than, I think it does come from two sources. And one source is, what can I do with that data? Mm-hmm. The alternative perspective on this problem is, what are the decisions that I'm trying to make? And what data would enhance this decision? First of all, is this even the right decision that I'm trying to make? And where can I get the data to source input for that decision? So I think it's worth looking at it from both of these perspectives. And again, trying to spot these settings that are fairly narrowly scoped, where there's quite a lot of data. And again, the analytic techniques are sort of pre-written for us, right? It's not going to be a lot of code. For example, if we were to write together some algorithm that was analyzing call transcripts, the actual analysis of the call, the code to do that, would be just a few lines calling a library that's already been written in Python or whatever. Most of the code and most of our time would be spent on writing the user interface and on testing it and on debugging it. So the analytics technology itself is so readily available and ready to be used. It's the knowledge of which algorithm do I use and what is an appropriate setting where I'm going to get a return on some investment. How do I interpret the results of the analytics technique at the end of it all? And this is another space where I think the human element is not going away. If anything else, it's getting more important. And that is formulating the right question, identifying the setting where the analytics technology makes sense, and then interpreting the output of the result. I think that human element is not going away anytime soon.
And I have to agree with you. With unstructured data, you definitely need the human element in terms of making a decision and asking the right questions so that you actually get the best output. So how can regulators and even more broadly financial services providers get the best value out of the data that they have internally?
So again, I think that the answer to this question relies on a good match between the analytics technology and the decision setting. I think that also a key piece of this is being able to make the case for the ROI, because operating in a public funding model requires, number one, the ability to make the business case, and number two, the receptivity of the funding agent, right?
Mhm.
And so this is another important bit that gets back to university education, where I think that not only should universities be preparing people to take innovation-based roles in regulation and the private sector, but also in policy and in government,
Mm.
where the role of regulatory innovation is appreciated and understood, and the need for change is recognized. So we talk about change agents a lot, and training change and change leadership and change management, but training the resource sponsors is going to be key for the next, I think, 5-10 years. So again, I think that the question is asked best from the point of view of what are the decisions that I'm making, and what is missing in the decisions that I'm making, and what are the data sources that could potentially be leveraged for that.
I think those are key points to consider for people to get the best value out of the data, regardless as to whether you're a regulator or financial services provider. So in this discussion, one of the things that I've held on to is that compliance efforts need to become more sophisticated and more nuanced, which may mean that current benchmarks and indicators have to become more subtle. Do you see artificial intelligence or AI becoming more incorporated into data analytics in the future?
So in limited settings, yes. In the near future, in the regulatory space, no. I think we're quite a ways away from that. As an example, I had a conversation recently with a senior member of the compliance team at a really large multinational firm that anyone in your audience would recognize immediately. And we were talking about data challenges and implementation of data techniques and analytics. And he said for a recent compliance-related task, his team spent days tracking down some data that needed to be reported. And eventually they found it, but it had been recorded on pencil and paper.
Ooh.
And this is one of the most sophisticated organizations in the world. So I think that we're quite a long ways from AI making an impact in the regulatory space. And I think that another thing to be aware of is that all of this analytics technology sits inside an ecosystem in a firm or an organization that consists of governance and incentives and culture and ethics. Okay, so I may have the best loan prediction model in existence, and I may even have prescriptive artificial intelligence algorithms that are setting terms of a loan. But what's to keep me as a banker from ignoring that, just levering up and taking the risk because I have an incentive to do it, or because the governance measures around it aren't strong enough to monitor my behavior, right? What about the screening employees who are going to make the decisions around this content? So I think that the answer is the technology is not mature enough yet for this type of setting. I think we'll start to see it's starting to pop up in more isolated spaces and in on the revenue side. Another thing to remember is these algorithms that require training data are only as good as the training data.
Okay.
If the training data is off, the algorithm is off, and it's worthless, because that's the artificial part of artificial intelligence, is that the computer only does what we tell it to do, and it only learns from the data we give it. So if you're training, let's say you're training an AI to play a game, okay? Maybe you're training it to play chess, to beat you at chess.
Right.
If at the beginning you feed it a few bad games or you do some crazy things, you've thrown it off and it's no good. So again, short answer, I think no, there's quite a ways to go yet.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And you've highlighted two areas that I think are always at the forefront of regulators' mind, which is the governance structure in a lot of the financial services providers, but also the employee vetting process. I think that those things can never be understated in terms of making sure that the tone from the top is well set to incorporate these things and to make sure that they have the effect that is being sought. But taking it a step further, one of the things that financial services regulators and financial services providers have been working very hard on is leveraging the data that they have so that they're more effective and efficient. And this is particularly relevant for regulators given the scrutiny that they are subjected to by FATF and OECD, which stress efficacy. How do you see that focus on efficacy shifting to the supervisory engagements that will come in the future using data analytics?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question because it raises an additional level of complexity. So what I mean is this. A regulator facing a particular decision or a particular task with a particular set of data may use some technology to automate to make a prediction, to understand the data, to detect anomalies, et cetera. And that's we see that, we know how that's done. That's just a question of having sort of the right skills, the resources to invest, and a setting that makes sense. But when you introduce another layer of regulation on top of that, then you have additional complexity, because insights taken from an algorithm might not satisfy those extra layers of regulatory compliance. And we're seeing this in the audit space, particularly. So if you have auditors working in a regulated environment and they're using, maybe they're using AI contract analysis as in their audit procedures for audit evidence, how do the regulators feel about that as evidence? It's not like going back and looking at work papers, because now we have this algorithm that gave me some recommendation based on some training data it had whenever it made that assessment. But when the regulators come back and audit the auditor, they don't even have access to that training data. The computer algorithm has changed, right? Because it's been fed new training data and it's updated its model. And so we may have really good insight. We may have better, because we may have a situation where the computer reads the contract, it does a good job, it does maybe a better job than the human at finding the relevant information quickly, but it might not satisfy the regulator because their standards aren't up to date to match the technology, or they might not just understand it, or there just might be a technical complication of having that data to support the conclusion. So I think there is opportunity here when we're talking about sort of large-scale data, anti-money laundering type of data. But the multi-regulator, the interaction there has to be in sync and sort of agreement on what constitutes the appropriate use of the analytics technology.
And I really do appreciate that answer, because there is a lot of complexity that's added by international standard setters and shifting or changing requirements. But it's one of the challenges that regulators continue to face as standards are enhanced. It is typically in response to threats that have been detected, changes in criminal behavior, and a number of other drivers. So it's definitely a point to consider. So I think these points are very topical at this particular point in time in history, as we are on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution. I must ask this question: is there such a thing as too much data?
So I think it's tempting to think, no, data storage is so cheap, processing power is so cheap, you can't have too much data. But I think that going back to something I mentioned earlier, which was the survey of data scientists and the problems in their organizations and their data science operations. The very first, the biggest problem that they identified was dirty data. And that refers to data that is unusable for a number of reasons. It could be duplicate data, there could be missing observations, there could be inconsistent formats, the data could be of unclear origin, or it could be, its interpretation could not be clear. It could be inconsistent data because of merging data from two legacy data sources. The reason why this is such a big problem is because it's really time consuming to try to clean that data, because that involves a really a cross-functional effort between data analysts and IT and management and accounting and maybe finance and maybe marketing and who knows. And this person who left X number of years ago and didn't document exactly where that data came from or what the format is. So that is why it's the number one problem in the survey. So it's a technical problem in a way, but it's also an organizational and a human problem. So to make that data usable is really costly and really time consuming. So I think the answer is at the organizational level, absolutely, yes. There is such a thing as too much data. And so the focus needs to be on the quality of the data and the usability of the data rather than the quantity of the data generated.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Willis. Your insight and experience has given quite a few touch points for persons to think of. And there were some thought-provoking points that practitioners in financial services, both regulators and financial services providers, could take away and consider. Data analytics is definitely essential, and I think for the regulators, it's vital if you want to become more nimble and innovative and effective. So audited financial statements, I think one of the areas where we get a lot of information as regulators is within audited financial statements. And invariably, there are a lot of regulatory bodies that do not have auditors as regulators. So persons who might have had a former life as an auditor. And from my experience, I've had a bit of audit experience. I've been able to detect some anomalies. One such area is related party transactions, where there may be loans to related persons such as a director or shareholder. There are no terms of repayment, and there are other things that cause concern. From your perspective, what value do you think there is for auditors to have, for regulators to have an audit training or audit training light, not necessarily a whole degree in accounting and audit practice, but to have some sort of training in that area?
I think that the larger question here is, so to answer your particular question, absolutely. So understanding the process of how financial statements are produced and all of the mechanisms that are designed to enhance their trust all make you a more effective user of the financial statements and a consumer of financial statements. And particularly from the regulator perspective, when the decision you're trying to make is not, should I invest equity or should I lend, your decision is quite different, where it's a compliance-oriented role and really a public service role. So when I talk to my students, I always couch this in the question of trust. For my experienced students, we talk about in a very first day of class, we talk about financial statements, and I ask the question, do you trust them? And they kind of think, and they start to think about it, and they go, I don't know, maybe. And then we talk about what are the mechanisms in place designed to enhance the trust of financial statements. We have the board of directors that's supposed to monitor management on behalf of the shareholders. We have accounting standards. We have regulatory enforcement. We have potential civil penalties or criminal penalties. We have auditors. We have the market for corporate control. We have the voluntary disclosures. All of these are things that enhance or are designed to enhance the trust of the financial statements. And then as we walk down each one of these and take a close look at are they doing their job, we start to sort of, the concerns start to pile up, right? So take Theranos, for example. You're familiar with Theranos, which is the fraudulent startup around the blood testing innovation, right? The blood testing machine that was meant to test for, however many, conditions, but was a complete fraud and never worked. Who was the auditor for Theranos? The answer is there wasn't one. They didn't have an auditor. So some of the most sophisticated investors in the world were happy to invest in this company that did not produce audited financial statements. What's that tell you? That tells me that there's a concern out there with the quality of audit and the role of audit. But if you as a regulator have experience going through the audit process and are able to bring the regulatory perspective around and go, okay, I know what an audit should do. I know what it's designed to do. I know what a good audit does and what audit quality is. That definitely informs my ability to be a more skeptical consumer of financial statements. If I had experience as a board member, I'm going to read financial statements a bit differently, aren't I? And I'm going to approach that from a governance angle. And so I think absolutely. So having the perspective and sort of the empathy that comes from participating and seeing these trust enhancing mechanisms firsthand absolutely strengthens your position.
Well, thank you for that. But one of the questions I have, I know that you deliver the lectures and course material for Masters in Accounting program at Cambridge Judge Business School. Is that a line of study that regulators could benefit from? And is it something that regulators should consider in terms of building their capacity and knowledge base?
So our Masters of Accounting program at Cambridge was designed to train and prepare change leaders in the accounting and finance space, broadly speaking. And so with everything, we approach it from this perspective of policy and strategy and change. So it's not sort of a technical qualification-based program. So for example, when we talk about financial accounting, we approach this from the angle of why are the standards written like they're written? How could you move from a position of taking the standards as given into a space of understanding why they are like they are and becoming a more effective advocate for better standards? When we talk about audit, we don't talk about how to do an audit. We talk about why does audit not seem to be meeting its role in society or its potential role in society? Or is that even true? And how should audit be regulated? And given all of that societal stuff, when you someday might be the chair of an audit committee, how do you implement an audit in a healthy way in your organization? When we talk about management accounting, we talk about what gets measured inside your organization and why and how and what needs to change around that process. When we talk about, we have a lot of content around change and an explicit module around change management where our students develop a comprehensive change plan, which includes things like risk management, which includes things like understanding where the power lies in an organization, what might be the objections to it, and how do you understand and use that power to influence and to get your change plan adopted. And so our students will develop a comprehensive change plan. And because we're a part-time program, a lot of our students use that as opportunities to strengthen some of their work projects or some of their volunteer work. We have students with 5 years of work experience or a little bit less. We have students with 15, 20 years of work experience. We have students from the private sector, from banking, and from public accounting. We have students from regulatory bodies. We have students from entrepreneurship, from public sector as well. And so that's important to us, that diversity, because our model in the classroom is not a lecture-based model where the professor knows everything and is talking at the students and they're just taking it in passively. It's a very active model that's based on discussion and debate, and policy and strategy analysis. And so when you have an auditor from the Big Four in UK sitting with a regulator from Hong Kong, sitting with a military officer from the US at a table, and they're discussing these issues, you get some really, not only some really, we can facilitate some really dynamic learning and some really impactful learning, but also a community and a culture that is really healthy and really strong.
Well, thank you for that context. I think that really gives some insight to the program, and we'll be sure to include links to the program for any person who is interested in following up, as well as supplemental details. And I would just like to thank you again, Dr. Willis. Your insight and experience has provided thought-provoking content for both regulators and financial services providers to take away and consider. Data analytics and understanding the importance of audited financial statements and the role of accounting and innovation for service providers is key. But for regulators, it is vital if we are to be more nimble, innovative, and responsive in this ever-changing world. And I'm definitely looking forward to continuing the discussion with you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Simone.
Thanks.
The Anguilla Financial Services Commission would like to thank Cambridge Judge Business School for their participation. Any references within this episode can be found in the links provided below. For more information on our FinTech licensed businesses, please contact us by email at innovate@afsc.ai.